Sometimes God puts the right person in the right place at exactly the right moment. On a cold Montana evening in 1871, that person was Jedediah Stone, a lonely mountain man who'd spent 15 years hiding from the world. Jed lived alone in his cabin, avoiding people and trouble. He was tired from the Civil War and wanted peace. But riding home one night, he found two little girls by a burned house. 6-year-old twins Clara and Junie were starving and scared. Their parents were gone. The fire had taken everything. This hard man who barely talked to anyone looked down at them and said 4 words that changed everything. What happened next shocked the whole frontier. But could one broken man really save 2 lost children from the dangers ahead? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The tarnished Civil War Scout Medal lay buried beneath a pile of maps and ammunition in the corner of Jedediah Stone's one-room cabin, forgotten like the man who'd earned it. For 15 years, it had gathered dust while Jed lived the life of a ghost, moving through the Montana wilderness with the silence of snow falling on pine needles. His cabin sat tucked deep in a grove of towering evergreens, invisible from any trail unless you knew exactly where to look. That's how Jed preferred it. The morning had started like any other. Jed rose before dawn, fed his horse Thunder, and checked the snares he'd set for rabbits. At 58, his body moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that careless movements could mean death. His weathered hands bore the scars of 100 battles, both in war and in the unforgiving wilderness that had become his sanctuary. Grey streaked his dark beard, and deep lines etched his face like a map of sorrows, too heavy to speak aloud. He'd served as a scout for the Union Army during the war, moving behind enemy lines with a skill that had earned him the nickname the Ghost of Shiloh. But that man seemed like a stranger now. The war had taken everything from him, his faith in humanity, his belief in causes worth dying for, and most painfully, his ability to trust his own judgment after that terrible night when friendly fire had claimed his closest friend. The ride to town for supplies took 3 hours each way, a journey Jed made only when absolutely necessary. He preferred the company of Thunder and the occasional visit from Joseph Crow Feather, a Crow Indian trader who respected Jed's need for solitude. They would sit by the fire, sharing coffee and comfortable silence, 2 men who understood that some wounds could only heal in quietude. But as evening approached on this particular day, something felt different. Thunder's ears pricked forward as they rounded the familiar bend in the trail, and Jed's hand instinctively moved to the rifle strapped to his saddle. Smoke rose in the distance, not the thin, controlled smoke of a cooking fire, but the thick, acrid column of a structure burning out of control. Jed urged Thunder forward, his heart hammering with a rhythm he hadn't felt since the war. As they crested the small hill overlooking the Hendricks homestead, the scene before him struck like a physical blow. The modest cabin where Thomas and Mary Hendricks had been building their dream lay in smoldering ruins. The barn had collapsed into a pile of charred timber, and the vegetable garden Mary had tended so carefully was trampled into mud. But it was the small figures huddled against the stone foundation of what had been the cabin that made Jed's breath catch in his throat. 2 little girls, no more than 6 years old, sat clinging to each other in the failing light. Their identical faces were streaked with soot and tears, their simple dresses torn and blackened. Even from a distance, Jed could see they were trembling, whether from cold, fear, or hunger he couldn't tell. Probably all 3. "Clara, Junie," he called out as he dismounted, remembering the twins from his occasional encounters with their father in town. Thomas Hendricks had been a good man, honest and hard-working, the kind who'd tip his hat to a stranger and mean it. The girls looked up at the sound of Jed's voice, their eyes wide with terror and something that might have been hope. Clara, always the braver of the 2, struggled to her feet and stepped protectively in front of her sister. "Mama and Papa won't wake up," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. The fire came so fast, and the men rode away, and now they won't wake up. Jed's jaw tightened as he surveyed the scene more carefully. This wasn't an accident. The pattern of destruction, the way the fire had spread, the churned earth around the cabin, all of it spoke of deliberate violence. Someone had done this, and they'd left two little girls to die in the aftermath. He knelt down in front of the twins, noting how thin they'd become, how their eyes had that hollow look of children who'd seen too much. A charred wooden doll lay nearby, Clara's favorite, he remembered, somehow salvaged from the flames, despite its damaged state. The girls hadn't eaten in days, that much was clear, and winter nights in Montana could kill the unprepared faster than any bullet. "Where have you been sleeping?" Jed asked gently, though his voice carried the rough edges of a man unaccustomed to speaking with children. "Under the wagon," Junie whispered, pointing to an overturned farm wagon that had provided minimal shelter. "We've been waiting for Mom and Papa to wake up, but they're so cold now." The simple words hit Jed harder than any enemy fire. These children had been guarding their parents' bodies, waiting for them to come back to life, slowly starving while maintaining their innocent vigil. His hands clenched into fists as rage burned through him. Rage at whoever had done this. Rage at a world that would leave children defenseless. And rage at himself for feeling anything at all after so many years of carefully constructed numbness. Without another word, Jed stood and walked to where Thunder waited patiently. He pulled his heavy coat from behind the saddle and returned to wrap it around both girls. The coat swallowed their small frames, but it would keep them warm. "Listen to me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Your mama and papa have gone to heaven. They can't wake up anymore, but they loved you very much, and they'd want you to be safe." Clara's lower lip trembled, but she nodded with a gravity that broke Jed's heart. "Are you going to take us somewhere safe?" Jed looked into those trusting brown eyes and felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening after being locked for 15 years. He thought of his empty cabin, his solitary existence, his carefully maintained isolation from a world that had shown him nothing but pain. Then he looked at these two small souls who had no one left in the world, and his decision made itself. "Get on my horse now," he said simply. The words came out before he'd fully considered what they meant. Taking in these children would change everything. It would mean responsibility, vulnerability, the constant fear of losing someone precious again. It would mean opening his heart to the possibility of pain beyond anything the war had taught him. But as he lifted Clara and then Junie up onto Thunder's broad back, settling them safely in front of the saddle, Jed realized he didn't care about the risks anymore. These girls needed him, and perhaps, though he wouldn't admit it yet, he needed them too. The ride back to his cabin passed in silence, broken only by the soft sniffles of grieving children and the steady rhythm of Thunder's hooves on the mountain trail. Jed found himself hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every possibility of danger. Already his protective instincts were awakening from their long slumber. When they reached the cabin, Jed helped the girls down and led them inside. The space that had seemed perfectly adequate for one man suddenly felt impossibly small and rough. The single bed, the crude furniture, the complete absence of anything resembling comfort for children, it all struck him with new eyes. "I'll make up a place for you to sleep," he said awkwardly, gathering every spare blanket he owned. "Are you hungry?" Both girls nodded, though they seemed almost afraid to admit it. Jed's cooking skills extended to basic survival, beans, bacon, hardtack, but he found himself wishing he knew how to make the kind of meals a mother would prepare. Still, he did his best, warming beans over the fire and cutting thick slices of bread he'd bought in town. As the girls ate with the desperate hunger of the truly starving, Jed studied their faces in the firelight. They were identical twins, but Clara seemed more outgoing, while Junie appeared content to follow her sister's lead. Both had their mother's gentle features and their father's determined chin. They were going to be beautiful women someday, if they lived long enough. That thought brought back his earlier suspicions about the fire. Someone had wanted the Hendricks family gone, and they might not be satisfied knowing the children had survived. Jed would need to be careful, alert, ready for trouble. The isolation that had protected him all these years might not be enough to keep two little girls safe. As the evening wore on, exhaustion finally claimed the twins. Jed tucked them into his own bed, taking the floor without complaint. In the darkness, he listened to their soft breathing and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been whether the coming winter would be harsh enough to keep unwanted visitors away. Now he was responsible for 2 orphan children in a territory where law was often decided by whoever had the most guns and the least conscience. But as sleep finally took him, Jed's last conscious thought wasn't about the dangers ahead. Instead, he found himself remembering Clara's brave little voice saying, "Mama and Papa won't wake up," and the way both girls had trusted him completely when he'd said those 4 simple words, "Get on my horse now." Perhaps after 15 years of running from responsibility, from connection, from the possibility of loss, it was time to remember what he'd been fighting for during the war. Not causes or politics or abstract ideals, but the simple human duty to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Outside, the Montana wind whistled through the pines, carrying the promise of an early winter. But inside the small cabin, 3 unlikely souls had found each other in the darkness, and something that might eventually become a family had taken its first tentative breath. 3 days after bringing the girls home, Jed heard the unmistakable sound of multiple horses approaching his cabin. He'd been teaching Clara and Junie how to identify different bird calls when thunder's warning whinny cut through the morning air. In one fluid motion, Jed rose from where he'd been sitting with the girls and moved to the window, his hand finding the rifle that now never left his side. "Stay low and quiet," he whispered to the twins, his voice carrying the calm authority they'd already learned to trust. Both girls immediately dropped to their hands and knees, crawling behind the wooden table as Jed had taught them during their brief but intensive lessons in caution. Through the gap in the curtains, Jed counted 4 riders. The lead man wore a star on his vest, Sheriff Murphy from Copper Falls, a town 3 days' ride south. Jed had met Murphy a handful of times over the years, usually when some fool prospector had gotten lost in the mountains and needed finding. Murphy had always struck him as competent enough, if a bit too eager to please whoever held the most influence in any given situation. Jed stepped outside, keeping his rifle ready but not obviously threatening. "Sheriff Murphy," he called out. "Bit far from your usual territory, aren't you?" Murphy dismounted, and Jed noticed the other 3 men remained in their saddles, hands resting conspicuously near their weapons. They weren't deputies. Their clothes were too fine, their horses too expensive. These were hired guns trying to look respectable. "Jed Stone," Murphy said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm afraid I've got some difficult news. There was a fire at the Hendricks place a few days back. Tom and Mary didn't make it out." "I heard about that," Jed replied carefully. "Tragic thing." "Yes, well, the thing is, their twin girls are missing. We've been searching everywhere, and someone mentioned seeing you in that area around the time it happened." Murphy's eyes swept over the cabin, looking for any sign of the children. "You haven't seen 2 little girls, have you? About 6 years old?" Jed's grip tightened on his rifle. Something felt wrong about this entire conversation. Murphy was nervous, sweating despite the cool morning air, and he kept glancing at the mounted men as if seeking approval for his words. "Can't say that I have," Jed lied smoothly. "Why are you so interested in finding them? Seems like the kind of job for family or the church, not the law." One of the mounted men leaned forward in his saddle. He was a lean, sharp-faced individual with cold eyes and an expensive gun belt. "The name's Silas Garrett," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from money and violence in equal measure. "I represent certain business interests in the territory. The Hendricks family held a legal claim to some valuable land, and with the parents dead, those children are the rightful heirs, and you want to help them with their inheritance out of the goodness of your heart?" Jed's tone was flat, skeptical. Garrett's smile was thin as a knife blade. "Something like that. Children that young need proper guardianship, legal representation. The territory can be dangerous for orphans." The threat in those words was subtle, but unmistakable. Jed understood perfectly. Garrett wanted the girls under his control so he could manipulate their inheritance for his own purposes. If they couldn't be found, they might simply be declared dead, and their land would likely end up in Garrett's hands through legal maneuvering. "Well, if I see them, I'll be sure to let you know," Jed said. Sheriff Murphy nodded quickly, clearly eager to leave. "That's all we can ask. We'll be searching the area for another day or two, so if you hear anything—" "Of course." As the four men rode away, Jed remained outside until they disappeared from view. Only then did he return to the cabin, where he found Clara and Junie exactly where he'd left them, still crouched behind the table with wide, frightened eyes. "Were those the bad men?" Clara whispered. The question hit Jed like a physical blow. These children had seen their parents murdered, because that's what it had been. He was certain now, and they'd recognized something in Garrett's voice that confirmed their worst fears. "You heard the men who hurt your mama and papa?" Jed asked gently, kneeling down to their level. Junie nodded, tears starting to flow. The skinny one with the mean voice. "He told Papa to sign papers, and when Papa said no, he got so angry." Clara took her sister's hand. "We hid in the root cellar like Mama told us, but we could hear everything. The fire started after the loud noises stopped." Jed's blood ran cold. The girls had witnessed their parents' murder, and now the killers were actively searching for them. Garrett hadn't just stumbled across two convenient orphans. He'd created them deliberately when Thomas Hendricks had refused to sign over his land rights. "Listen to me very carefully," Jed said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Those men can never know you're here. Do you understand?" "Never." Both girls nodded solemnly. Jed moved to a loose floorboard near the fireplace and pried it up, revealing a hidden compartment where he kept important documents. Among them was an official-looking paper with stamps and seals, the land deed that Thomas Hendricks had shown him once, proudly explaining how he'd legally claimed the valley where his cabin sat. The land was valuable, Jed now realized, probably for mining or railroad development. "Your papa was a smart man," Jed said, showing the girls the deed. "He hid this with me for safekeeping, and those men don't know about it. This paper proves the land belongs to you, not to anyone else." Clara studied the document with the seriousness of a much older child. "Does this mean we can go home?" "Someday, maybe," Jed said carefully. "But right now, those men think you're dead, and that keeps you safe. If they knew you were alive, they'd try to hurt you like they hurt your parents." The weight of what he was taking on settled over Jed like a landslide. Protecting these children meant more than just keeping them fed and sheltered. It meant standing against men like Garrett, who had money, influence, and apparently corrupt law enforcement on their side. It meant becoming the target of dangerous people who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who stood in their way. But as he looked at Clara and Junie, brave, scared, trusting little souls who had already lost everything once, Jed knew there was no choice to make. He'd failed to protect his friend during the war, failed to save the innocent lives lost to friendly fire under his watch. He wouldn't fail these children. "We're going to need to be very careful from now on," he told them, "and very smart. But I promise you this, no one is going to hurt you while I'm alive." That evening, as the girls slept, Jed stood watch at his window and planned. Garrett would be back, probably with more men. The sheriff was clearly compromised, which meant no help would come from official channels. Joseph Crowfeather might be willing to help, but Jed couldn't ask his friend to risk his life for children who weren't his responsibility. No, this fight would be his alone. A ghost from the Civil War, protecting two little girls against men who dealt in murder and greed. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 15 years of hiding from conflict had found him anyway, but this time he realized with grim satisfaction he had something worth fighting for again. And Silas Garrett was about to learn why they'd called him the Ghost of Shiloh. The morning after Garrett's visit, Jed pulled out a hand-drawn map he'd kept hidden for years, a detailed chart showing supply caches he'd established throughout the surrounding mountains. During his early years of isolation, paranoia and old military habits had driven him to prepare for emergencies that might never come. Now, studying the faded pencil marks that indicated hidden stores of food, ammunition, and medicine, he realized his caution might save 3 lives. Clara, Junie, he called to the girls, who were playing quietly with Clara's damaged wooden doll. Come here. We're going to learn some important things. Over the next few days, Jed began teaching the twins skills he'd never imagined sharing with 6-year-old children. He showed them how to identify safe plants from poisonous ones, how to find water in the wilderness, and how to move through the forest without leaving obvious tracks. The girls absorbed everything with the intense focus of children who understood their lives might depend on these lessons. Clara proved especially adept at the outdoor skills, her small hands learning to tie knots and her sharp eyes quickly spotting the landmarks Jed used for navigation. Junie was more cautious but equally determined, asking thoughtful questions about why certain techniques worked better than others. Why do we step on rocks instead of dirt? Junie asked during one of their forest walks. Because rocks don't hold footprints the way soft ground does, Jed explained patiently. If someone's tracking you, you want to make it as hard as possible for them to follow, like hide and seek. But more important, Clara added, her young mind making the connection between games and survival. Exactly like that. During the quiet evening hours, when the day's lessons were done and the girls were settling down for sleep, Jed found himself sharing small pieces of his past. Nothing about the war's violence or his deeper traumas, but gentler memories that helped the children understand the man who'd taken them in. I had a horse before thunder, he told them one night as they sat by the fire. His name was Captain, and he was the smartest animal I ever knew. He could find his way home from anywhere, even in the dark. What happened to him? Clara asked, snuggled against Jed's side with a trust that still amazed him. He got old and went to horse heaven, Jed said simply. But before he did, he taught me that sometimes the best friend you can have is one who doesn't need to talk much. These conversations seemed to ease something in the girls, helping them process their own grief while building their connection to their unlikely guardian. They began calling him Papa Jed, despite his protests, and Jed found he didn't mind as much as he pretended to. The preparation work intensified when Joseph Crow Feather arrived for his monthly visit. The crow trader took one look at the 2 little girls and raised an eyebrow, but he made no comment until they were alone. So, Joseph said in his quiet way, accepting a cup of coffee from Jed, the lonely mountain man has become a father. It's temporary, Jed said, though the words felt hollow even to him. Joseph studied his friend's face with eyes that missed nothing. The heart doesn't recognize temporary when it comes to children. These are the Hendricks girls, aren't they? The ones from the burned cabin, Jed nodded, knowing he could trust Joseph with the truth. There are men looking for them. Dangerous men who killed their parents for land rights. Joseph sipped his coffee thoughtfully. And you plan to protect them. I don't see that I have much choice. There's always a choice, old friend. The question is whether you can live with the consequences of not protecting them. Joseph's visit brought more than philosophical conversation. It brought supplies and valuable information. The trader's network of contacts stretched across the territory, and the news he carried was troubling. Silas Garrett has been asking questions in 3 towns, Joseph reported. He's hired more men, professional gunfighters from Denver. Word is he's offering $1,000 for information about 2 little girls. Jed's jaw tightened. $1,000 would tempt a lot of people to look the other way about 2 children's safety. More than that, it would tempt them to actively hunt for the girls. Garrett's made it clear he wants them found before winter sets in. As Joseph prepared to leave, he pulled Jed aside. I prepared some things for you, he said, indicating a heavy pack on his horse. Medicine, preserved food, warm clothes for the girls. And this, he handed Jed a small, intricately carved wooden whistle. Crowmake. It carries far in the mountains, and the sound is like a bird call. If you need help, use it. I'll know. Joseph, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Those children have no one else, and you're a good man trying to do right by them. In my tribe, that makes it everyone's responsibility to help. After Joseph left, Jed spent 2 days setting up an intricate system of early warning signals around his cabin. Tripwires connected to small bells, carefully arranged piles of stones that would tumble if disturbed, and sightlines that would let him spot approaching riders from a considerable distance. The work was familiar, like setting up a military perimeter, and it felt good to use skills that had kept him alive during the war. Clara and Junie helped where they could, fetching tools and supplies with the eager helpfulness of children who wanted to contribute. Jed found their presence oddly comforting during the tense preparation work. Their laughter and questions broke up the grim focus on potential violence, reminding him what he was fighting to protect. "Are you making traps for the bad men?" Clara asked, watching Jed carefully position a length of fishing line across a game trail. "Something like that," Jed replied. "But these traps won't hurt anyone. They'll just tell us if someone's coming so we can hide." "We're getting good at hiding," Junie observed proudly. "Yesterday I hid so well that Clara couldn't find me for 10 whole minutes." Jed smiled despite his worries. That's exactly the kind of skill that might keep you safe. But even as he worked to fortify their position, Jed knew it might not be enough. Garrett had money, men, and apparently the law on his side. Winter would provide some protection. The mountain passes would become difficult to navigate, and most sensible people would avoid the high country until spring. But determined men with enough resources could push through even harsh weather if the prize was valuable enough. As the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the pine trees with white, Jed stood on his cabin's small porch and watched Clara and Junie attempt to catch snowflakes on their tongues. Their giggles echoed off the surrounding peaks, a sound of pure joy that seemed to make the entire landscape brighter. 3 weeks ago, his greatest concern had been whether his winter supplies would last until spring. Now he was responsible for 2 precious lives, and men who dealt in murder and corruption were actively hunting them. The transformation should have terrified him, but as he watched the girls play in the snow, Jed realized he felt more alive than he had in 15 years. Whatever came next, whatever dangers Garrett and his men might bring, Jed would be ready. The ghost of Shiloh had found something worth protecting again, and he wouldn't let these children down. The blizzard arrived without warning in the 3rd week of November, transforming the mountain landscape into a white wasteland that could kill the unprepared in hours. Jed woke to the sound of wind howling around the cabin like a living thing, and when he looked outside, he could barely see thunder in the lean-to shelter just 20 feet away. "Is it always this loud?" Clara asked, pressing close to the window to watch the snow whip past in horizontal sheets. "Mountain storms can be fierce," Jed replied, checking their supplies with new urgency. "But we're well prepared. This cabin has weathered worse. For 3 days, the storm raged without mercy." Jed kept the fire burning constantly, melting snow for water and carefully rationing their food, while the girls adapted to being confined in the small space. He was impressed by how well they handled the forced isolation, entertaining themselves with quiet games and helping with simple chores. But on the 4th morning, Jed woke to a different sound, not the wind, but a thin, high whimpering that made his blood run cold. Junie lay curled in the bed she shared with her sister, her small body burning with fever and her breathing labored and uneven. "Clara, wake up," Jed said gently, shaking the older twin. "Your sister is sick." Clara sat up immediately, her face creasing with worry as she felt her sister's forehead. "She's so hot," she whispered, "and she was coughing in the night." Jed knelt beside the bed, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the sick child. Junie's cheeks were flushed with fever, and when she opened her eyes, they were glassy and unfocused. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and Jed could hear a wheeze in her chest that spoke of serious lung congestion. "Junie, can you hear me?" he asked softly. The little girl's eyes found his face, but she seemed to be looking through him rather than at him. When she tried to speak, only a weak cough emerged. Panic clawed at Jed's chest, a familiar terror from the war. When he'd watched good men die from wounds that might have been treatable with proper medical care. But there was no doctor within 3 days' ride, and the storm made travel impossible, even if he'd been willing to risk exposing their location. "What can we do?" Clara asked, her young voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Jed forced himself to think clearly. Joseph had left medical supplies, including willow bark for fever and various herbs for respiratory ailments. More importantly, he taught Jed some basic remedies during their years of friendship. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. "We're going to take very good care of her," Jed said with more confidence than he felt. "First, we need to get her fever down." He sent Clara to fetch snow while he prepared a cool bath in the large washing basin. The process of gently bathing Junie's fevered body seemed to provide some relief, and her breathing became slightly less labored. Jed then wrapped her in dry blankets and prepared a tea from the willow bark, adding honey to make it more palatable for a sick child. "Small sips," he instructed, holding Junie upright so she could drink without choking. Just a little at a time. For the next 2 days, Jed barely slept. He maintained a constant vigil beside Junie's bed, monitoring her breathing, adjusting her position to help drain the congestion from her lungs, and forcing fluids down her throat whenever she was conscious enough to swallow. Clara proved to be an invaluable assistant, fetching supplies, preparing meals, and talking softly to her sister during the worst moments. "Tell her about the horses we're going to have someday," Jed suggested during one particularly difficult night. When Junie's fever had spiked again and she was delirious, Clara took her sister's hot hand and began speaking in the gentle, patient voice of a natural caregiver. "Remember how Papa said we could have ponies when we got older? We'll have a white one and a brown one, and we'll ride them every day in the meadow behind the house. They'll be gentle and smart, just like thunder." As Clara spoke, Jed watched Junie's face relax slightly, as if her sister's voice could reach her even through the fog of illness. The bond between the twins was something deeper than mere family connection. They were two halves of the same soul, and Clara's strength seemed to flow directly into her weaker sister. On the 3rd night of Junie's illness, Jed felt his own strength beginning to fail. The constant worry, the lack of sleep, and the weight of responsibility for both girls had pushed him to his limits. As he sat beside the bed, listening to Junie's labored breathing, dark thoughts crept into his mind. What if she died? What if his inexperience and inadequate medical knowledge cost this innocent child her life? "Papa Jed." Clara's small voice interrupted his spiral of despair. He looked over to find her standing beside his chair, holding a cup of coffee she'd somehow managed to prepare despite her age and the challenging conditions. "You need to rest," she said with the solemnity of a much older child. "I can watch Junie for a while." The simple gesture, this brave little girl taking care of him while her sister fought for her life, broke something loose in Jed's chest. For the first time since the war, he felt tears threaten to spill over. "You're a remarkable young lady, Clara," he said, accepting the coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "Your parents would be very proud of you." "They'd be proud of you too," Clara replied, settling into the chair beside Junie's bed. "You saved us, and now you're saving her." That night the fever finally broke. Jed woke from a brief, exhausted sleep to find Junie's eyes clear and alert, her breathing easier and her temperature nearly normal. She was weak and would need careful nursing for several more days, but the crisis had passed. "I was dreaming about Mama," Junie whispered when she saw Jed's concerned face hovering over her. "She said I had to stay because Clara needs me and you need us both." Jed's throat tightened. "Your mama was a smart woman. I'm very glad you listened to her." As Junie recovered over the following week, something fundamental shifted in their small household. The crisis had forged them into a true family, bonded by shared fear, shared relief, and the deep trust that comes from weathering life's storms together. Clara had proven herself capable of remarkable maturity and selflessness, while Junie's quiet courage during her illness had shown strength that belied her gentle nature. And Jed, the man who'd spent 15 years avoiding emotional connections, found himself completely, irrevocably committed to these two remarkable children. They called him Papa Jed, and for the first time he didn't protest. Whether he'd intended it or not, he'd become their father in every way that mattered. When the storm finally passed and sunshine returned to the mountains, Jed stepped outside to find a world transformed by snow and ice. But the most profound transformation had occurred inside the cabin, where a lonely man and two orphaned girls had discovered that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to love and protect each other, no matter what dangers lie ahead. Spring arrived in the Montana mountains like a cautious animal emerging from winter's den. The snow began its gradual retreat up the higher peaks, leaving behind muddy trails and swollen streams that spoke of the world awakening after months of frozen sleep. For Jed, the changing season brought a mixture of relief and growing dread. Winter's protective isolation was ending, and with it, the natural barrier that had kept Garrett's men at bay. He'd used the quiet months well, deepening his bond with Clara and Junie while preparing for the troubles he knew would come. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard lay his war journal, a leather-bound record of tactics, observations, and hard-won knowledge from his days as the ghost of Shiloh. The yellowed pages now served a different purpose, filled with new entries about protecting children instead of conducting military operations. Enemy force estimated at 8 to 12 men, he'd written in his careful script. Advantage, terrain knowledge, defensive position. Disadvantage, non-combatant dependents limit mobility and tactical options. Primary objective, preserve life of Clara and Junie Stone. He'd written their new surname without conscious thought, but seeing it on paper made something settle in his chest with quiet certainty. The girls had flourished during the winter months. Clara's natural aptitude for outdoor skills had blossomed under Jed's patient instruction, and she could now track animals, identify edible plants, and move through the forest with impressive stealth. Junie, though more cautious by nature, had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger, often alerting them to approaching wildlife or weather changes before any visible signs appeared. "Papa Jed," Clara called from the cabin's doorway, where she stood scanning the valley below with the alertness he'd taught her. "There's smoke coming from the old Johnson place." Jed looked up from where he'd been checking his trap lines, his attention immediately sharpening. The Johnson homestead had been abandoned for 2 years, and smoke meant human presence, potentially hostile human presence. "How much smoke?" he asked, moving to join her. "Just a little. Like a cooking fire, not a big blaze." Through his field glasses, Jed could make out a thin column of smoke rising from the direction of the abandoned cabin. Someone had taken shelter there and given Garrett's renewed search efforts. It was unlikely to be innocent travelers. That evening, Jed left the girls with strict instructions to remain hidden while he conducted reconnaissance. Moving through the moonlit forest with skills honed by years of warfare and wilderness living, he approached the Johnson place from downwind, using every shadow and natural cover point. What he found there changed everything. A woman sat by a small fire outside the cabin, tending to a pot of what smelled like rabbit stew. She was young, perhaps 30, with the weathered hands and cautious eyes of someone who'd learned to survive on the frontier. But it was the rifle across her knees and the way she constantly scanned her surroundings that told Jed she was running from something or someone. As he watched from concealment, a child emerged from the cabin, a boy of perhaps 8 years, thin and obviously hungry. The woman immediately gestured for him to stay low, and Jed realized they were refugees, just like Clara and Junie, making a decision that went against every tactical instinct. Jed stepped into the firelight with his hands clearly visible. "Don't reach for that rifle," he said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt you." The woman's eyes widened, but she kept her hands away from her weapon. "Who are you?" "Someone who understands what it's like to protect children from dangerous men." "My name is Jed Stone." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "You're the mountain man. Joseph Crow Feather mentioned you. And you are?" "Maria Santos. This is my son Diego." She studied Jed's face in the firelight. "Joseph said you might be trustworthy. He also said you had troubles of your own." Over the next hour, sharing coffee and carefully guarded conversation, Jed learned Maria's story. She'd been married to a small rancher south of Copper Falls until Silas Garrett had decided he wanted their land for a railroad spur. When her husband had refused to sell, Garrett's men had burned them out, killing her husband in the process. She and Diego had been on the run for 3 weeks. "Garrett has the sheriff in his pocket," Maria said bitterly. "Murphy won't investigate the murder, won't protect witnesses. Anyone who speaks against Garrett ends up dead or disappeared." "How many others?" Jed asked. "At least 6 families that I know of. Some fled the territory, some—" She shrugged helplessly. "Garrett's building an empire, and he doesn't care who gets hurt." As dawn approached, Jed made another decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. "Come with me," he said. "I've got a secure place, and you'll be safer with allies than alone." Maria's eyes searched his face. "Joseph said you were protecting 2 little girls." "The Hendricks twins?" Jed nodded. "Clara and Junie. They're good children, and they've been through enough. Having other people around might actually help them." The journey back to Jed's cabin took most of the morning, with frequent stops to ensure they weren't being followed. When they finally reached the hidden settlement, and Jed called out the recognition signal he'd taught the girls. "It's Papa Jed. I'm bringing friends." Clara and Junie emerged from their hiding spot behind the cabin, their faces curious but cautious. The sight of another child, Diego, standing protectively close to his mother, seemed to ease their wariness. "These are my daughters," Jed said, the word coming naturally now. "Clara and Junie, meet Maria and Diego Santos." The introductions were shy but warm, with Clara taking immediate charge of showing Diego around their defensive preparations while Junie hung back, studying the newcomers with her usual careful assessment. That evening, as the expanded group shared dinner around Jed's table, he found himself observing the dynamics of their unlikely alliance. Maria was clearly a capable woman, her survival skills honed by necessity and tragedy. Diego was quiet but alert, old beyond his years, in the way children became when violence had touched their lives too early. "What's your plan?" Maria asked as the children played a quiet game by the fire. "Survive until Garrett gives up or finds easier targets," Jed replied honestly. "I'm hoping winter discouraged him enough that he'll move on to other schemes." Maria shook her head. "Men like Garrett don't give up. They escalate. And now that spring's here, he'll have more resources, more men willing to work for his money. Then we'll be ready for them." "Will we?" Maria's eyes were serious. "I've seen what his hired guns can do, Jed. Professional killers from Denver and Kansas City. They're not going to be scared off by mountain men and bear traps." As if summoned by her words, Joseph Crow Feather materialized out of the darkness beyond the cabin, moving with the silent grace that had kept him alive in a hostile world for 60 years. "Jed," he said simply, "we need to talk." The news Joseph brought was worse than Jed's darkest fears. Garrett had indeed hired professional gunfighters, 8 men with reputations for violence that stretched across the frontier. More troubling, he'd somehow obtained information about Jed's true identity. "He knows about the ghost of Shiloh," Joseph said quietly, keeping his voice low so the children wouldn't overhear. "He's telling people he's going to collect the bounty on a Civil War deserter." Jed's blood ran cold. There had never been any desertion charges against him, but Garrett had enough influence to create false documents, to rewrite history for his own purposes. If Jed was branded a fugitive, it would justify whatever violence Garrett wanted to inflict. "How long do we have?" Jed asked. "They're already moving. My sources say they'll reach this area within days." As Joseph melted back into the night, carrying promises to gather what intelligence he could, Jed stood on his porch and looked up at the star-filled sky. 6 months ago, his greatest concern had been maintaining his solitude. Now he was responsible for 4 lives, facing professional killers who had the law's blessing for their violence. But as he listened to the soft sounds of children's laughter drifting from the cabin, Clara and Junie and Diego finding moments of joy despite the dangers surrounding them, Jed felt his resolve crystallize into something harder than steel. Garrett wanted to fight with the ghost of Shiloh, then that's exactly what he would get. The wanted poster arrived nailed to a tree along the main trail, where Joseph found it during his morning reconnaissance. The aged paper bore an official-looking seal and offered $500 for the capture of Jedediah Stone, alias the Ghost of Shiloh, wanted for desertion and murder of fellow soldiers during the Battle of Chattanooga. Jed stared at the poster with grim recognition of Garrett's cunning. Every word was a lie, but the document looked authentic enough to fool anyone who didn't know the truth. Worse, it transformed him from a protective guardian into a dangerous fugitive in the eyes of the law. "They're very clever," Maria observed, reading over his shoulder. "Now anyone who helps you becomes an accessory to harboring a criminal, and anyone who kills me becomes a hero collecting lawful bounty," Jed finished. Garrett's covered all his angles. Clara, who'd been listening with the intense focus she brought to anything concerning their safety, spoke up. "But you didn't do those things, did you, Papa Jed?" The simple question cut straight to the heart of everything. Jed knelt down to meet her eyes, knowing this conversation would define their relationship forever. "No, I didn't desert, and I never murdered fellow soldiers," he said carefully. "But I did make a terrible mistake during the war that got good men killed." He told them about that night at Chattanooga, how fog and darkness had led to confused orders, how his recommendation for a flanking maneuver had put friendly troops in the path of their own artillery. 3 men had died because of his tactical error, including his best friend Samuel Morrison. "That's why I came to the mountains," Jed concluded. "I couldn't live with myself after that." Junie, who'd been silent throughout his confession, surprised everyone by speaking up. "Mama used to say that mistakes don't make you a bad person unless you don't learn from them." The wisdom in those words, coming from a 6-year-old who'd survived more tragedy than most adults, hit Jed with unexpected force. He pulled both girls into a fierce hug, realizing that their unconditional love might finally allow him to forgive himself for sins that had haunted him for 15 years. But personal redemption would have to wait. That afternoon, Diego came running back from a scouting mission with news that chilled everyone's blood. 8 riders, he gasped, having sprinted the last half-mile to the cabin. Professional men with good horses and new rifles. "They're making camp at Willow Creek." Willow Creek was only 6 miles away, close enough that determined men could reach the cabin within hours. Jed gathered his makeshift family around the kitchen table, spreading out the hand-drawn maps that showed every trail, cave, and hiding spot within 20 miles. "We can't run," he said bluntly. "Not with children, not against mounted men who know we're somewhere in this area. Our only advantage is knowing this terrain better than they do." Maria traced the defensive positions Jed had marked on the map. "You're planning to fight them here?" "I'm planning to make them think twice about what they're hunting," Jed corrected. 8 professional gunfighters against 1 man is suicide. But 8 men hunting ghosts in unfamiliar mountains? That's a different kind of fight entirely. Over the next several hours, Jed shared tactical knowledge he'd hoped never to use again. He taught them about fields of fire, escape routes, and the psychological warfare that had made the Ghost of Shiloh a legend during the Civil War. "Fear is a weapon," he explained to the assembled group. "Make your enemies afraid of shadows, afraid of silence, afraid of their own imaginations, and you've already won half the battle." Clara listened with the intense concentration she brought to all of Jed's lessons. "Like when we hide so well that people think we're not really there." "Exactly like that, but bigger. We're going to make them think this mountain is haunted." As evening approached, Joseph returned with additional intelligence. Garrett's men had questioned everyone at the trading post in Copper Falls, offering money for information about the mountain hermit and his stolen children. Most people had claimed ignorance, but Joseph worried that someone might eventually talk. "There's something else," Joseph said quietly. "Garrett isn't just after the girls anymore. He wants you specifically, Jed. This has become personal for him." "Why? I never did anything to him." "Word is, you remind him of someone from his past. A Union scout who cost him a lot of money during the war when you disrupted a Confederate supply operation near Vicksburg." The memory came flooding back. A night raid on a supply depot. Confederate gold, intended for purchasing weapons from European dealers. Jed had led a small team that destroyed the entire operation, capturing the gold and dealing a significant blow to Confederate logistics in the region. Silas Garrett, Jed said slowly. He was a Confederate quartermaster. I remember him now, young, ambitious, loud about how the war was going to make him rich. Well, he eventually got rich anyway, Joseph observed. And apparently he's held a grudge against the ghost of Shiloh ever since. That night, as the others slept, Jed sat by the dying fire and made peace with what he had to do. For 15 years, he'd run from his identity as a soldier and a leader of men. But these children, his children, needed the ghost of Shiloh now more than they needed the broken hermit he'd become. Maria found him there in the early morning hours, staring into the embers as if reading his future in their glow. "You're going to fight them," she said. "It wasn't a question. I'm going to protect our family," Jed replied. "Whatever that takes, the children can't be part of this. They're too young, too innocent." "They're already part of it," Jed interrupted gently. "The moment Garrett decided to murder their parents for money, they became part of it. I can't change that, but I can make sure they survive it." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks gold and crimson, Jed began his final preparations. He cleaned and loaded every weapon he owned, checked the positions of his supply caches, and reviewed the tactical plans he'd sketched during the long night. Clara and Junie found him arranging gear with the methodical precision of a soldier preparing for battle. "Are we going to have to hide again?" Clara asked. "For a while," Jed admitted. "But this time we're not just hiding. We're hunting too. Hunting the bad men." "Hunting the bad men," he confirmed. Junie slipped her small hand into his weathered one. "We trust you, Papa Jed. You saved us before, and you'll save us again." The simple faith in her voice strengthened Jed's resolve more than any military briefing ever had. These children believed in him completely, trusted him with their lives and their future. He would not let them down. As Garrett's professional killers prepared to invade his mountain sanctuary, the ghost of Shiloh made ready to remind the world why some legends never die. Sheriff Murphy arrived at dawn, alone and apparently unarmed, calling out to the cabin from the edge of the clearing. "Jed Stone, I know you're in there. I need to talk to you about those children." Jed watched through his rifle scope, studying every detail of the man's posture and positioning. Murphy appeared genuinely nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if he expected trouble from behind rather than ahead. "He seems different," Maria whispered from her position by the window. "More scared than threatening." Against every tactical instinct screaming warnings in his head, Jed made the decision to hear Murphy out. The sheriff had always seemed like a weak man rather than an evil one, and something about his demeanor suggested desperation rather than aggression. "Stay with the children," Jed told Maria. "If this goes wrong, get them to the north cache and wait for Joseph." He stepped outside, rifle ready but not obviously threatening. "Sheriff Murphy, you're a long way from your jurisdiction." Murphy dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Jed, I need to tell you something important. About Garrett, about what's really happening here. I'm listening. First, those wanted posters, they're complete fabrications. I know because Garrett had them printed at Morrison's shop in Billings. The man who made them told me about it when he got drunk last week." Jed kept his expression neutral. "That's interesting information, Sheriff. Why are you sharing it?" Murphy's shoulders sagged as if a great weight was pressing down on him. "Because I'm tired of being Garrett's puppet. Because what we did to the Hendricks family was murder, plain and simple, and I can't live with it anymore." The confession hung in the morning air like smoke from a gun barrel. Jed felt his grip tighten on his rifle as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. He asked quietly. "Garrett has photographs," Murphy said miserably. "Compromising photographs from before I became sheriff, when I was young and stupid and made some very bad choices. He's been blackmailing me for 3 years, forcing me to look the other way when his men run families off their land. And the Hendricks family?" Murphy's face crumpled. "I was supposed to be there that night to make it look official when they refused to leave. But when Garrett's men started the fire with Tom and Mary still inside..." He shook his head violently. I couldn't watch. I rode away and let it happen. Jed studied the sheriff's face, reading the genuine anguish there. This was a man drowning in guilt and shame, looking for any chance at redemption. Why tell me this now? Because Garrett's planning something worse. He's not just coming for the girls anymore. He wants to make an example. He's going to burn this entire mountainside, claim you were running an outlaw hideout that threatened innocent settlers. The tactical implications hit Jed like a physical blow. A wildfire in these dry summer conditions could devastate thousands of acres, potentially killing everything and everyone in its path. Garrett wasn't just planning murder, he was planning genocide on a scale that would eliminate all witnesses and evidence. When? Jed demanded. Tomorrow night. He's got men positioned at every trail leading down from this area. When the fire starts, anyone who tries to escape, Murphy didn't need to finish. Jed understood perfectly. Garrett intended to trap them in the flames, like the Hendricks family had been trapped in their burning cabin. There's more, Murphy continued. Maria Santos is here, isn't she? Garrett knows. He followed her trail from the Johnson place. A chill ran down Jed's spine. If Garrett knew about Maria, then their security had been compromised from the beginning. They'd been living under the illusion of safety while their enemy planned their destruction. How does he know so much about our movements? Murphy's face went pale. Joseph Crowfeather. Garrett's been paying him for information. The words hit Jed like a rifle shot to the chest. Joseph, his friend for 15 years, the man he trusted above all others, had been betraying them to their enemies. Every conversation, every shared piece of intelligence, every tactical plan had been reported back to Garrett. That's impossible, Jed said, but even as he spoke, pieces of evidence began clicking into place. Joseph's convenient arrivals with information about Garrett's movements, his knowledge of their defensive preparations, his insistence on knowing details about their plans and capabilities. Garrett's got something on him too, Murphy explained. Joseph's grandson was arrested in Denver on a murder charge. Garrett arranged it, and he can arrange for the boy to hang or go free, depending on Joseph's cooperation. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Joseph had become family over the years, the closest thing to a brother Jed had known since the war. To learn that their friendship had been weaponized against the children he was trying to protect felt like losing Samuel Morrison all over again. But there was no time for grief or rage. If Murphy was telling the truth, they had less than 24 hours before Garrett's final assault began. Why are you warning me? Jed asked. What's in it for you? Murphy reached slowly into his vest and pulled out a badge. Not his sheriff's star, but a smaller, older badge that Jed recognized as belonging to a deputy U.S. Marshal. Because I took an oath once, Murphy said. Before Garrett corrupted me, before I became a coward, I swore to protect innocent people. Those children in there deserve better than what I've become. Your federal law enforcement was. I resigned in shame 3 years ago after Garrett got his hooks into me. But maybe it's not too late to remember what I used to stand for. Jed studied the badge, then Murphy's face, weighing trust against suspicion. Everything about this encounter felt wrong, too convenient, too perfectly timed. But if Murphy was telling the truth about the fire, then conventional defensive tactics would be useless. They needed to evacuate immediately. Prove it, Jed said finally. If you want my trust, prove you're not working for Garrett right now. Murphy nodded, as if he'd expected the challenge. Tonight, Garrett's men are camped at 3 locations: Willow Creek, Bear Ridge, and the old mining camp at Sulphur Springs. 8 men total, armed with Henry repeating rifles and enough ammunition for a siege. Garrett himself is staying at the Territorial Hotel in Copper Falls, maintaining distance so he can claim innocence if things go wrong. The level of detail suggested genuine intelligence rather than manipulation. More importantly, it gave Jed tactical information he could use to verify Murphy's claims. There's something else, Murphy continued. Joseph is supposed to guide Garrett's men to your exact location tomorrow morning. He thinks he's just providing reconnaissance, but Garrett plans to have him killed afterward to eliminate witnesses. That detail felt true in a way that made Jed's stomach turn. Garrett would never leave loose ends, and Joseph's usefulness would end the moment the children were captured or killed. "What do you want from me?" Jed asked. "Help me stop this. Help me find some small redemption for what I've allowed to happen." Murphy's voice carried the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a rope. "I can't bring back the Hendricks family, but maybe I can save their children." As if summoned by mention of them, Clara appeared in the cabin doorway. Her young face was serious as she studied the sheriff with the careful assessment Jed had taught her. "Is he one of the bad men, Papa Jed?" she asked quietly. Jed looked at Murphy, weak, compromised, guilt-ridden, but perhaps genuinely seeking redemption, and made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed. "No," he said finally. "I think he's just a man who's made some very bad choices and wants to make better ones." Murphy's shoulders straightened slightly, as if some burden had been lifted. "Thank you for the chance." "Don't thank me yet," Jed replied grimly. "If you're lying about any of this, if you're leading Garrett to these children, I'll make sure you don't live to regret it." "I understand." As Murphy remounted his horse to return to town, Jed called out one final question. "The fire tomorrow night, how are they planning to start it?" "Greek fire," Murphy replied. "Military incendiary devices left over from the war. Garrett's had them stored in the old mine shaft for months, waiting for the right opportunity." As the sheriff disappeared down the mountain trail, Jed stood in his doorway and processed the magnitude of what he'd learned. Joseph's betrayal had compromised every defensive plan they'd made. Garrett commanded superior numbers, better weapons, and now had detailed intelligence about their capabilities and positions. And in less than 24 hours, the entire mountainside would become a death trap of fire and smoke. For the first time since taking in Clara and Junie, Jed wondered if his promise to protect them had been nothing more than the prideful boast of an old man who'd forgotten the hard realities of war. But as he turned back toward the cabin, where 3 children and 1 brave woman waited for his leadership, Jed felt the ghost of Shiloh awakening fully for the first time in 15 years. Garrett wanted to play with fire? Then it was time to remind him that some ghosts were forged in flames. The small wooden whistle Clara carried in her pocket had been carved by Jed during the long winter nights, its simple design hiding the complex series of tones that could carry messages across mountain valleys. Now, as she practiced the signals one final time, the whistle represented their last line of communication in what might be their final battle. 3 short blasts means danger approaching, Jed reviewed patiently, though they'd practiced the signals dozens of times. 2 long tones means all clear, and long 2 short means retreat to the secondary position. Clara nodded solemnly, slipping the whistle back into her pocket. At 7 years old, she'd become an essential part of their tactical planning, her small size and natural stealth making her an ideal scout and messenger. "I understand, Papa Jed, but what if—" "No what-ifs," Jed interrupted gently but firmly. "We've planned for every situation we can think of. Trust the plan, trust your training, and trust each other." The afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the clearing where Jed's makeshift family prepared for what might be their last day together. Maria was checking their escape packs for the 3rd time, ensuring each contained food, water, medical supplies, and warm clothes for the mountain nights. Diego helped by organizing ammunition and checking the condition of their limited weapons. Junie sat quietly on the cabin steps, her small hands carefully folding letters she'd written to each member of their group. The sight of her solemn concentration broke Jed's heart. No child should have to prepare farewell messages before a battle. "What are you writing?" he asked, settling beside her. "Letters for if something bad happens," she said matter-of-factly. "Mama used to say that words of love should never be left unspoken." Jed's throat tightened. "That's very wise advice. I wrote one for you too," Junie continued, holding out a carefully folded piece of paper. "But I hope you never have to read it." The letter was brief, written in a child's careful script. "Dear Papa Jed, thank you for saving us and loving us and teaching us to be brave. You are the best papa in the whole world. If you are reading this, it means I had to go to heaven with Mama and Papa, but I will wait for you there. Please take care of Clara and don't be sad. Love forever, Junie. Jed folded the letter carefully and placed it in his vest pocket, next to his heart. I promise you, little one, that I'll do everything in my power to make sure I never have to read this. As evening approached, the final pieces of their desperate plan fell into place. Murphy had returned with additional intelligence about Garrett's positions and timing, confirming the details he'd shared earlier. More importantly, he'd brought news that changed everything. There's a federal marshal coming through Copper Falls tomorrow, Murphy reported. Marshal James Harrison, investigating reports of illegal land seizures in the territory. If we can get evidence to him, get the children to safety long enough for him to act, Garrett will disappear into the wind the moment he hears about a federal investigation, Jed pointed out. Men like him don't stay around to face justice. Maybe, but if we can expose his operation, save the children, and give Harrison enough evidence to issue warrants, it might be enough to stop him permanently. It was a thin hope, but better than no hope at all. The plan they'd developed was dangerous and complex, requiring split-second timing and more than a little luck. But it was their only chance to turn the tables on Garrett's superior numbers and resources. The abandoned mining camp at Sulphur Springs would be their battlefield. Joseph was supposed to lead Garrett's men there at dawn, believing he was guiding them to Jed's location. Instead, he would find Jed waiting with a proposition that might save all their lives if Joseph was willing to risk his grandson's life for redemption. You can't be sure he'll choose the right side, Maria warned as they made their final preparations. Men under that kind of pressure don't always make rational decisions. Joseph's been my friend for 15 years, Jed replied. Garrett may have corrupted him, but I have to believe there's still honor in him somewhere. And if you're wrong? Jed checked his rifle one final time, feeling the familiar weight of a weapon that had served him through countless battles. Then we'll fight with what we have and trust in Providence. Clara and Junie approached as the last light faded from the western sky, their young faces serious but determined. They'd changed from their everyday clothes into the dark. Practical outfits Jed had made for them, clothing designed for moving unseen through the forest. We're ready. Papa Jed, Clara announced. Are you sure you understand your part? Jed asked, kneeling to their level. It's going to be dangerous, and if anything goes wrong, we'll be careful, Junie promised. And we'll stay together no matter what. And we'll use the whistle if we need help, Clara added. Jed pulled both girls into a fierce embrace, memorizing the feel of their small bodies against his chest, the scent of their hair, the absolute trust in their young voices. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, these children had given his life meaning again after 15 years of emptiness. I love you both, he whispered, more than all the stars in the sky. We love you too, Papa Jed, they chorused, their arms tightening around his neck. Maria gathered her own son close, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Diego, remember what we practiced. Stay low, stay quiet, and if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to any of us, Diego interrupted with the fierce certainty of a child who'd already lost one parent. We're going to win because we're the good people, and good people always win in the end. From your mouth to God's ears, Maria murmured, pressing a kiss to her son's forehead. As the group made their final equipment checks, Jed found himself studying each face in the lamplight, trying to memorize every detail. These people had become his family through shared danger and mutual trust, forged into something stronger than blood by their determination to protect each other. Murphy appeared in the doorway, his deputy marshal badge pinned prominently to his vest. He'd made his choice, abandoning the corrupt path Garrett had forced him down in favor of the oath he'd once sworn to protect the innocent. It's time, he announced quietly. The journey to their positions took 3 hours, moving carefully through the darkness along paths only Jed knew. Clara and Junie were assigned to the highest ground, where they could observe the entire battlefield and relay information through their whistle signals. Maria and Diego took position near the mining camp's old exit tunnel, ready to provide covering fire or facilitate an emergency escape. Jed and Murphy would face Joseph and Garrett's men directly, gambling everything on their ability to turn the situation around through a combination of tactical superiority and moral persuasion. As they settled into their final positions, Jed felt the familiar calm that had always come over him before battle during the war. Fear and doubt faded away, replaced by absolute focus on the task ahead. The ghost of Shiloh was fully awake now, every sense heightened, every tactical instinct sharpened to a razor's edge above them. Clara's whistle sounded once, the all-clear signal that meant Garrett's men hadn't yet reached the area. They still had time to prepare, to set their trap, to turn the hunter into the hunted. In the distance, a wolf howled, a sound that spoke of wild freedom and fierce protection of family. Jed smiled grimly in the darkness, checking his weapons one final time. Garrett had underestimated what he was hunting. The corrupt businessman thought he was chasing a broken hermit and some helpless children. Instead, he was about to face a ghost who'd found something worth dying for, and a family willing to fight for each other against any odds. The night settled deeper around them, full of promise and peril in equal measure. Dawn would bring the final confrontation, and with it, the chance to transform their desperate defense into something much more dangerous, a counterattack that would either save them all or destroy them in the attempt. But whatever the outcome, they would face it together as a family forged in fire and tested by adversity. And that, Jed realized as he settled into his position overlooking the mining camp, was worth any risk. Dawn broke over the mountains like a gunshot, sudden and sharp, cutting through the darkness with golden light that revealed 8 horsemen approaching the abandoned mining camp. Jed watched through his field glasses as Joseph Crowfeather led Garrett's hired gunmen along the winding trail, his weathered face etched with resignation and shame. The military compass that had guided Jed through countless Civil War battles now rested heavy in his palm, its needle pointing true north toward safety, or toward the confrontation that would determine everything. He'd carried this compass through Shiloh, Chattanooga, and a dozen other battlefields, and it had never failed to bring him home. Today, it would guide him through the most important mission of his life. "Remember," he whispered to Murphy, who crouched behind the mining equipment beside him, "when I give the signal, you move to cover the children's escape route. Whatever happens to me, get them to Marshal Harrison." Murphy nodded, his reformed lawman's badge catching the morning light. "Understood." 3 short blasts echoed from Clara's whistle position high above, danger approaching. Jed could see her small form pressed against the rocks, nearly invisible in her dark clothing, watching over them like a guardian angel with a child's fierce courage. Joseph dismounted at the edge of the camp, his movements slow and deliberate. Garrett's men spread out behind him in a tactical formation that spoke of military training and professional competence. These weren't random drifters or desperate outlaws. They were killers who understood their business. "Jed Stone," Joseph called out, his voice carrying across the empty camp. "I know you're here." Garrett's offering terms. "Safe passage for you if you hand over the children." Jed stepped into view, his rifle ready but not immediately threatening. The sight of his old friend, the man who'd sat by his fire so many winter nights, sharing coffee and comfortable silence, hit him harder than expected. "Joseph," he said simply. The Crow trader's shoulders sagged at the sound of his name spoken without anger or condemnation. "Jed, I'm sorry. I never wanted—" "I know about your grandson," Jed interrupted. "And I know what Garrett threatened. Then you understand why I had to—" "I understand fear," Jed said. "I understand desperation. What I don't understand is how you could look at 2 little girls and decide their lives were worth less than your grandson's." One of Garrett's men, a lean killer with cold eyes and quick hands, shifted position to get a better angle on Jed. But the movement triggered something Clara had spent months learning to recognize, the subtle signs that preceded violence. Her whistle sounded again. 1 long, 2 short blasts. "Retreat to secondary position," but instead of retreating, Jed saw movement from the rocks above. Clara herself was repositioning, using the skills he taught her to gain a tactical advantage. The sight of his 7-year-old daughter maneuvering like a seasoned scout filled him with equal parts pride and terror. "The children aren't here," Jed lied smoothly. "I sent them away when I learned about your betrayal." Joseph's face crumpled. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, old friend. Garrett's men will tear these mountains apart looking for them. At least if you cooperate." The voice came from an unexpected direction as Murphy stepped into view, his badge prominent and his weapon trained on the nearest gunman. "I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Murphy, and I'm placing all of you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The professional killers reacted with the speed of men who'd survived by being faster than their opponents. Guns cleared leather in a blur of motion, but Jed was already moving, diving for cover behind a rusted mining cart as bullets sparked off metal and stone. "Down!" he roared toward the children's position, hoping Clara and Junie would remember their training about taking cover during gunfire. Murphy's first shot took down the lean killer who'd been eyeing Jed, but return fire from 3 directions forced the lawman to dive behind a timber support post. Wood splinters exploded around him as heavy bullets chewed through his inadequate cover. Joseph stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, caught between loyalty and survival, his own weapon still holstered. "Stop!" he shouted desperately. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this." Jed rolled to a new position, using terrain, and cover the way the ghost of Shiloh had once used them to survive impossible odds. His rifle spoke with deadly accuracy, and another of Garrett's men spun and fell, clutching a shattered shoulder, but they were still outnumbered, still outgunned, and the children were exposed on the hillside above. One stray bullet, one tactical mistake, and everything he'd fought to protect would be lost. That's when Maria's voice rang out from the mining tunnel behind Garrett's men, steady and clear despite the chaos. "Drop your weapons! You're surrounded!" The psychological effect was immediate. Professional gunfighters were used to superior numbers and advantageous positions. Being caught between multiple enemies in unfamiliar terrain shifted the tactical balance in ways that raw firepower couldn't overcome. 2 of the remaining gunmen broke for their horses, deciding that whatever Garrett was paying wasn't worth dying in a mountain ambush. But their leader, a gray-haired killer with sergeant stripes tattooed on his wrist, rallied the others with the authority of a veteran soldier. "Stand and fight," he bellowed. "It's just a few locals with hunting rifles." His words were interrupted by the distinctive crack of a military sniper's rifle from high above. Clara had found Jed's backup weapon in their supply cache and was putting her marksmanship lessons to deadly use. The bullet took the gray-haired leader in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the rocky ground. In the sudden silence that followed, the sound of multiple weapons being cocked echoed from positions around the mining camp. Joseph slowly raised his hands, his weathered face streaked with tears. "Enough," he whispered. "No more killing." The family photograph lay crumpled in Silas Garrett's coat pocket as he emerged from the tree line on horseback, his face twisted with rage at the sight of his hired killers dead or surrendering. The image, taken by a traveling photographer just weeks earlier, showed Jed, Clara, and Junie standing together in front of their cabin, looking every inch the loving family they'd become. To Garrett, it represented everything he despised about people who stood in the way of progress and profit. "Enough." Garrett roared, his expensive pistol trained on Joseph, who still stood with his hands raised. "This ends now, Stone. Come out where I can see you, or I start killing everyone here one by one." Jed stepped from behind his cover, rifle ready but lowered. The years had aged Garrett considerably since their encounter during the war, but the cruel ambition in his eyes burned as bright as ever. "Silas Garrett," Jed said calmly. "Still hiding behind other men's guns, I see." "The ghost of Shiloh," Garrett sneered. "Not so impressive without an army to hide behind, are you?" "I never needed an army to deal with cowards and murderers." Garrett's face flushed red. "You cost me everything at Vicksburg. A fortune in Confederate gold, gone because of your meddling. I swore I'd see you pay for that someday. And that's what this is about. A grudge from a war that ended 15 years ago. This is about justice. Garrett spat. About making you suffer the way I suffered when your raid destroyed my future. Above them, Clara watched through the scope of Jed's rifle, her small finger resting lightly on the trigger. At 7 years old, she'd become a better marksman than many grown men, but she'd never had to decide whether to take a human life. The weight of that decision pressed down on her like a physical force. "Papa Jed," she whispered, knowing he couldn't hear her but needing to say the words anyway. "Tell me what to do." As if sensing her dilemma, Jed called out clearly, "Clara, remember what I taught you about protecting family. Sometimes the hardest choice is also the right choice." Garrett's head snapped up, scanning the rocks above. "So the children are here after all. How touching. A family reunion before I kill you all." "You're outnumbered, Garrett," Murphy called from his position. "Your men are dead or surrendering. Give yourself up, and maybe you'll live to see trial." "Outnumbered by whom?" Garrett laughed harshly. "A broken-down lawman, a mountain hermit, and some children." "I think not." He raised his pistol toward Joseph, clearly intending to make good on his threat to start killing hostages. But before he could fire, a small voice rang out from the rocks above. "Hey, mister!" Garrett looked up to see Junie standing in plain sight on a boulder, no longer hiding, her young face set with determination that reminded everyone present of her murdered father. "You killed my mama and papa," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "That was wrong." "Little girl," Garrett snarled, "you have no idea what—" His words were cut off by the distinctive whistle blast that Jed had taught Clara meant take the shot. The military rifle cracked from the rocks above, and Garrett's expensive hat flew from his head, the bullet passing close enough to part his hair. "The next one won't miss," Clara's voice called down, steady and sure despite her youth. "Drop your gun!" Garrett's eyes went wide as he realized he was being held at gunpoint by a child. The psychological impact was devastating. Everything he'd believed about his own power and control crumbling in the face of a 7-year-old's courage. "You wouldn't dare," he said, but his voice shook with uncertainty. "I would dare anything to protect my family," Clara replied, and everyone present could hear the echo of Jed's teaching in her words. In the moment of Garrett's distraction, Joseph made his choice. The Crow trader's hand moved to his own weapon, not to threaten anyone, but to remove himself from the equation entirely. He placed his pistol on the ground and stepped away from it, choosing redemption over self-preservation. "I'm done being your tool, Garrett," Joseph said quietly. "Do what you want with me, but these children have suffered enough." The gesture broke whatever hold Garrett had maintained over the situation. Maria and Diego emerged from their concealment, weapons ready. Murphy stepped forward with his badge gleaming in the morning sun. And Jed moved closer, his rifle trained on the man who'd caused so much pain and death. "It's over, Silas," Jed said with finality. "Your men are finished, your schemes are exposed, and Marshal Harrison is already investigating your illegal activities. You can surrender now, or you can die here in these mountains. Those are your only choices." Garrett looked around the circle of determined faces, children and adults united in their commitment to justice and protection of the innocent. For the first time in his life, his money and influence couldn't save him from the consequences of his actions. Slowly, with the bitter taste of defeat filling his mouth, Silas Garrett raised his hands in surrender. The reign of terror that had driven families from their homes and left children orphaned was finally over. Above them all, Clara and Junie climbed down from their rocky perch, their courage having played the decisive role in ending a conflict that had threatened to consume everything they loved. The family photograph in Garrett's pocket would eventually find its way back to its rightful owners, proof that love and determination could triumph. Over greed and violence, the ghost of Shiloh had fought his last battle, and this time, everyone he'd sworn to protect had made it home safely. 6 months later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the main street of New Haven, the thriving frontier town that had grown up around the former mining camp where Garrett had made his last stand. Clara and Junie Stone walked to school each morning, carrying leather satchels filled with books, tangible symbols of the bright future their courage had helped secure. The town had been named by Marshal Harrison himself, who'd arrived just hours after Garrett's surrender to find justice already served by a family of unlikely heroes. A new haven for families driven from their homes, he'd declared, and the name had stuck. Within months, displaced settlers began returning to reclaim their land, while new arrivals came seeking the kind of community where children's safety mattered more than any man's profit. Jed Stone, no longer a hermit, but not quite comfortable with his reputation as the town's founder and protector, sat on the porch of the modest house he'd built for his family. The structure was larger than their mountain cabin, but still possessed the practical simplicity that suited a man who'd learned to value substance over appearance. "Papa Jed," Clara called, as she and Junie raced up the front steps, their schoolbooks clutched in small arms that had once held rifles in defense of their family. "Miss Catherine says we're the best students in arithmetic class, and we're teaching the other children how to track animals and identify plants," Junie added, her gentle nature now enhanced by confidence born of surviving genuine danger. "Just like you taught us," Jed smiled, accepting the enthusiastic hugs his daughters bestowed on him every day after school. The simple ritual had become precious to him, proof that normal, peaceful childhood moments were possible even after everything they'd endured. "I'm proud of you both," he said, settling them on either side of his chair. "But remember, some of those skills should probably stay between us. Not every parent wants their children learning military tactics," Clara giggled. "We know, Papa Jed, we only teach the safe things, like which berries are good to eat and how to find water." The girls had adapted to town life with remarkable resilience, making friends easily while retaining the special bond forged during their months of danger. They still called Jed Papa Jed, despite his offers to drop the nickname, and he'd long since stopped correcting them. Legal adoption papers sat framed on his mantelpiece, signed by Marshal Harrison himself and making official what their hearts had known for months. Maria Santos emerged from the house, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. She'd become the closest thing to a mother the girls had known since losing their birth parents, and her relationship with Jed had evolved from alliance to friendship to something deeper and more lasting. "Diego's helping with the evening chores," she reported, settling into the chair beside Jed's. "He's grown 3 inches since spring. And I swear he's trying to eat us out of house and home. Growing boys need their food," Jed observed. "And speaking of growing, the town council asked me again about running for mayor." "And what did you tell them?" "The same thing I always tell them. I'm not a politician. I'm just a man who wants to protect his family and help his neighbors do the same." Maria studied his face with the understanding that came from shared trials. "But you've been doing exactly that for months now. Every time there's trouble, every time someone needs help, they come to Jed Stone. You've become their leader whether you wanted the title or not." The observation was accurate, and Jed couldn't deny it. Families throughout the region brought their disputes to him for resolution. Travelers sought his advice about safe routes through the mountains. When territorial officials visited to discuss law enforcement and land rights, they inevitably ended up in Jed's modest parlor, acknowledging his authority through deference, if not official appointment. Joseph Crow Feather rode up the street, his weekly visit as punctual as clockwork. The Crow trader had served 6 months in territorial prison for his role in Garrett's schemes. But his cooperation with Marshal Harrison's investigation and his obvious remorse had earned him a second chance. Now he worked as a liaison between the tribal nations and the growing settlement, using his knowledge and connections to prevent the kind of conflicts that had scarred so many frontier communities. "Jed," Joseph said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose spirit still bore the weight of his mistakes. "The tribal council sends their regards. They're pleased with how fairly their people are treated when they come to trade." "Everyone deserves fair treatment," Jed replied. "That's not negotiable." "No, it's not. And that's why they trust you, why everyone trusts you." Joseph accepted a cup of coffee from Maria and settled into the circle of chairs. There's news from the territorial capital. Governor's planning to make this an official county seat, and they want you to be the first sheriff. Clara and Junie looked up from their homework with obvious pride. Their Papa Jed was important, respected, sought after by people in high places. But more than that, he was theirs, the man who'd saved them, loved them, and built them a life filled with safety and possibility. "What do you think, girls?" Jed asked, including them in the decision as he always did with important family matters. "Should your old papa take on the job of keeping the peace officially?" "You already keep the peace," Clara pointed out with the practical wisdom that continued to amaze the adults around her. "You just don't wear a badge while you do it. And you protect everyone, not just the people who can pay you," Junie added. "That's what good sheriffs should do." As the sun set behind the mountains that had once hidden their desperate flight from Garrett's killers, Jed looked around at the life they'd built together. The town bustling with honest families, pursuing honest dreams. His daughters thriving in school and friendships, their childhood restored despite the violence they'd witnessed. Maria and Diego becoming integral parts of their extended family. Joseph finding redemption through service to the community he'd once betrayed. The tarnished Civil War medal that had once symbolized his shame now rested in a place of honor in their home, displayed alongside a photograph of the four of them, Jed, Clara, Junie, and Maria, taken by the same traveling photographer who'd captured their earlier family portrait. In the new image, their faces showed the peace that came from trials overcome and love freely given. "Sometimes," Jed said quietly, watching his daughters work on their lessons while Maria hummed softly beside him, "God does put the right person in the right place at exactly the right moment. And sometimes," Clara said without looking up from her arithmetic, "He puts the right family together too." The simple words carried a truth that settled deep in Jed's chest. He'd spent 15 years running from responsibility, from connection, from the possibility of losing people he cared about. But 2 starving little girls beside a burned-out cabin had taught him that some risks were worth taking, some fights were worth fighting, and some families were worth everything a man could give, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The sounds of their growing town, children playing, families gathering for evening meals, neighbors calling greetings across fence lines, created a symphony of normal life that Jed had never thought he'd hear again. The ghost of Shiloh was finally at rest, replaced by something far more valuable, a father, a protector, and a man who'd learned that redemption could come in the most unexpected forms. Sometimes it took the shape of 2 little girls saying 4 simple words, "Get on my horse now." And sometimes, if a man was very lucky, those words changed everything for the better. In the distance, a wolf howled. Not in loneliness this time, but in recognition of family found and territory protected. Jed smiled and pulled his daughters closer, understanding at last that he was exactly where he belonged.